Hi everyone, please mute your microphones. Okay, we'll start in a minute or two. Okay, we'll start. Second. Okay, hi everyone. Hope everyone's having a good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Staying healthy, keeping things into perspective. I know our lives are changing dramatically, and it's going to be here for a while. A lot of people in different countries, but this is a long process, and it's going to teach us a lot about ourselves. Teach us a lot about the world we inhabit. Hopefully, humanity will hopefully not suffer too much. Please, everyone, mute your microphone if you're on. And hopefully, HaKadosh Baruch Hu should give a Hatzalah. And I want to try each day to spend about 15 minutes a day just describing aspects that are more related, less related, but to give us an opportunity to, one second, we're setting here, an opportunity to orient ourselves through Talmud Torah or learning about our past and our history. So yesterday I spoke about, here, let me fix the video. Yesterday I spoke about the cholera outbreak in the 19th century and how Halacha responded to it, the famous story of Rabbi Saul Salanter. I'm gonna have to learn how to have a screen background that I'm not looking at myself. We'll see. Maybe I'll spotlight someone who doesn't have audio, video, and okay. I'll have to find a way to not look at myself, but so far I'm looking at myself. So if someone can maybe send a chat for me how to change the setting that I'm not looking straight at myself. It's very hard to talk to myself. But either way, I'd like to talk today about not what happened in the 19th century, but what happened in the 14th century and how it affected the Jewish world, and hopefully to get a little perspective. So, of course, the 14th century was the century that witnessed the terrible Black Plague, the bubonic plague. It occurred in a very limited time frame. It was 1347 to about 1351. It took 50 million lives of Europe, and some estimate that it took close to 60% of the people, the population in Europe. So just to give some perspective, and I'll try to talk about this in future shiurim, how this pandemic is similar to what happened in the past and how it's different. And how did it affect the Jewish world? So, of course, as you know, the Jews were caricatured, the Jews were accused, the Jews were scapegoated as the cause for this plague. The plague was caused, and you can wiki this, and I'm not a historian, I'm just giving you some basic background. It seemed to be a virus that was passed along somehow through rats. Their conditions of hygiene were very, very horrible and subpar. There's a bit of an irony, and I'll try to talk about this in some other points, that the Greeks and the Romans had great hygiene. They really were very careful about their hygiene. They built bathhouses and areas to attend to their hygiene, possibly even to a fault. They deified the human body a little bit too much. But somehow, with the switch into the medieval ages and dark ages in Europe, there's less attention to hygiene, less bathing, less changing of the clothing. Somehow there's something about the human identity that switched out of careful hygiene. People just didn't take care of their bodies. They lived in squalid conditions, and there was a message here about that pandemic as well, about how HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to tend to our hygiene. And this is not the issue of our pandemic. It's not a question of hygiene, although extremely cautious hygiene can help limit the pandemic. But here, in the Black Plague, it was a question of no bathing. They didn't change their clothing. They wore the same clothing for months at a time, if not years at a time. It was spread by rats, and the Jews were less affected, in part because of the various halachos of bathing and washing hands and mikvah and Shabbos that allowed us to have better hygiene, in part because we lived already in ghettos. We lived in, or if not formal ghettos, we lived in very, very unique areas, and we didn't use the same wells. We used our own water sources. So because the Jews suffered less, there were many blood libels, not really blood libels, but many pogroms although I'm not sure the word was used then, but riots. And interestingly enough, the Pope issued various decrees disclaiming the notion that the Jews were responsible and encouraging Christians not to pour their wrath on the Jews, not to scapegoat the Jews, but the masses didn't listen. Most of these pogroms took place in Western Europe, France, Germany, Spain, although much of the terrible, terrible pogroms, the 2,000, 3,000 people pogroms, occurred in France. There's a very infamous St. Valentine's Day, 1349, I think 2,000, 3,000 Jews were burned, but it happened in Basel. There were 2,000, 3,000 people were burned on a single day based on the fomenting mob and anger at the Jews. Keep in mind that this is all occurring 200, 250 years after the terrible Crusaders, Crusades, 1096, and it's really in the same land, so there's a lot of collective memory. And ultimately, if you take a bird's eye view, this is what causes Judaism and Jews of Western Europe more or less to migrate to Poland. You're now looking at the tail end of the glory, the golden era of Jews in France. They'll still remain in Germany because Germany is close enough to Poland. There's a lot of interaction, but there's a lot of migration because basically Jews have had it. They're no longer, especially with what happened in the previous century. Now remember, the previous century was a bit of an abatement in some ways. Remember, the Crusades occupied the end of the 11th century, the 12th century. The 13th century is an interesting century. So on the one hand, it's the glory age of the Jewish leaderships of the Maharam Rottenberg, 1215, dies in 1293. The Rush is born in 1250, dies in 1327, 20 years before the outbreak of the Black Plague and bubonic plague. So you've got the Rush and Maharam Rottenberg. So on the one hand, it's the height and the Valiatosos and the Beno Peretz. The other end, of course, in the middle of that century, in the middle of the 13th century, is the trial of Paris and the burning of the Talmud. So you've really got 3 centuries marked by persecution of the Jews. If you call the 11th and 12th century the century of the Crusades, 13th century, the trial of Paris and the burning of the Talmud, and the, of course, imprisoning of Maharam Rottenberg in the very, very infamous scene and story. And then now you've got the 14th century, and you've got the Black Plague. It's not localized to France. There's a lot happening in Spain also, but it's really happening. France and Germany is ground zero for the blood libels or the pogroms against the Jewish people. Anyway, what happens? What's the outcome? Essentially, in France and Germany, what develops is a Torah vacuum, very similar in many ways to the vacuum that many people felt existed after the Holocaust. You had an entire generation that was too preoccupied with survival to publish Svarim. So if you, let's say, take the Rush, who dies in 1327, remember the Rush has to run from France because he's accused of abetting the Maharam Rottenberg. So if you take 1327, 1347, for about 100 years or so, I'm rounding off the numbers, you don't really have Svarim being published and Torah scholarship being advanced in France, Torah scholarship being advanced in Germany. You have a generation, you miss a generation in the Masorah. The next appearance you have is in the 15th century. And you've got 3 leading Germanic Rabbanim. One is named as the Mahari Weil. Mahari Weil is Yaakov Halevi Mullen, who's born, I think, pretty much after 1351. I don't remember the date of his birth offhand. He dies in 1427. So if you're looking to date it, 1347, 1351 is the Black Plague. He's born after the Black Plague, after the bubonic plague, and he dies, ironically, of a virus in 1427, unrelated to the Black Plague. He dies of some virus that was occurring in the 15th century. So this is known as the Mahari Weil, and his Talmud was, I'm sorry, this is the Maharil, excuse me. His Talmud was, sorry, the Maharil was not the Maharil, his Talmud was the Mahari Weil, and the third leading Germanic rabbi is the Trumas Hadeshin, Rabbi Yisrael Israelite. So, and they're very conscious of the fact that they have to rebuild a Masorah after there was a vacuum in the Masorah. So you have the Maharil lamenting the fact that before the Black Plague, there was a generation of Gedolim who were very accomplished, who were very, very big Talmidei Chachamim, and in our generation, he says, after the Black Plague, we've lost that Masorah. Now, what's also interesting about the Maharil, and the Maharil is quoted a lot by the Ramah, the Maharil, I think because of this vacuum, was extremely, extremely sensitive to Minhagim. So very often you'll have the Maharil coming down very strongly in favor of Minhagim, even Nigunim. Like there are stories of the Maharil being makbid that the Chazan should sing the same Nigunim that were kept in this Beis Knesset for many generations. And you could theorize that when you have a continuous, consistent Masorah, So you have greater confidence to then change and evolve because the baseline of halacha is intact. It's called the mimetic tradition, where you've seen your father being like that, he's seen his father. There's a baseline, and then you're more open to slight changes in nigunim and merhagim. But when you have such chaos, so you have to hold on to something and you have to maintain some ground zero. And that's why the Ramah, compared to the Shulchan Aruch, the Ramah is such a advocate of minhagim because the Shulchan Aruch is based on Sephardi culture, and Sephardi culture was pretty, more or less, it was stable. Whereas Ashkenazi culture, Germany, France, England, there's a lot of movement and a lot of chaos and a lot of rerouting and relocation. So you see this very powerfully in the Maharil, who's very sensitive that he's a post-Black Plague restorer of the Masara. He's very, very adamant about minhagim. Just some personalities that lived through the Black Plague. Remember, the Rush is before, and the Maharil, Marival of Yisrael Israel are afterwards, and that leads to the migration. By and large, those are the last Germanic great Rabbanim, and it takes a couple centuries for the Germanic Jewish population to recover, and the next great golden era is probably around the end of the 17th, end of the century, 18th century, end of the 17th, early 18th century. Keep in mind, of course, that this is affecting Germany, France, and Spain. So this is Spain about 150 years before the Spanish Inquisition. So it's before the Spanish Inquisition. Now, who are the Rabbanim that still live through this process? I just want to mention three of them. One of them is named the Aguda. Now, the Aguda it was written by Alexander Zislin HaKohen. Okay, he late 14th century, lived through the Black Plague, and according to some positions, he actually died al Kiddush Hashem in one of these pogroms. And there's a great debate whether he did or he didn't, but there's an actual kinnah that was written about him dying in some of these pogroms in Erfurt, which is one of the cities in Germany. Others claim he didn't die al Kiddush Hashem because he's not referred to as Hakadosh. In those days, unfortunately, there were so many people, En Gedolim, who died al Kiddush Hashem, that when they were referred to in later generations, they're referred to as Hakadosh. So we don't find his name, but he wrote a major sefer that unfortunately, in part because it was published during this era, didn't become as popular, but was meant to be an early stage Shulchan Aruch. Namely, this Sefer Aguda collected all the halachos. It was still based on Masechtos. It was still based on the zoning of the Masechtos, and I'll mention the Sefer that more or less was more popular than the Aguda, and that's why the Aguda wasn't read as much. But what's interesting about the Sefer Aguda is he quotes all the halachos, Kachim, Tairos, Zerayim. We're soon going to see a major shift in the halachic landscape. And that shift is affected by none other than the son of the Rush. Who was the son of the Rush who lived through this period also, being the son of the Rush? The Rush dies in 1327. His son is Rabbeinu Yechiel. Rabbeinu Yechiel, then a Rush writes the Torah. Now, what makes the Torah so different from the Aguda is because he rezones halacha. Now it's no longer based on Masechtos, when you're just summarizing sugyos, let's say in the style of the Rif, who also wrote a Shulchan Aruch based on summarizing Masechtos, but now he remaps. There are four areas of halacha, and they're not based on Masechtos. Marital issues, Eben Ezer, monetary issues, Chashem Mishpat, halachos of the home, Yeridea, and Arachayim, which are ritual-based halachos, and time-based mitzvahs. So it's easier to find the halacha because now you've mapped it into four easy-to-find areas that are driven by simanim. So the Torah is a major sefer, and I won't say it preempts the Aguda, but it certainly attracts more attention. But the Ramah always quotes the Aguda. You'll find the Ramah quoting the Aguda a lot. So he's a personality that evidently was killed during one of these events. Another person who seems to have been killed in one of these events is a Rishon we don't see that often, Rabbeinu Ezriel Bar Yechiel. Now, those of you who've learned Nazir, there's a very famous parish, Rabbeinu Ezriel. He's a German Rav. He was a French Rav, and he lived in Rottenburg. So there was a Talmud of them around Rottenburg. So just to be able to speak about a Frenchman, not just a German. The Aguda was a German, Moshe Alexander Zislin HaKohen. This is a Frenchman who lived through the Black Plague and the pogroms. And then just to mention a very well-known Rishon in Spain, because in Spain there was a lot of pogroms as well. It wasn't the same volume, but it existed. In Spain, the Jews also, remember, the Jews weren't just the victims of the pogroms, they're also the victims of the plague. And in Spain, somehow, the Jews were more exposed, proportionate to the Jews in France and Germany. They say that in Saragossa, 4 to 5 Jews died in the plague. So there are a lot of Jews dying, and then, of course, facing the pogroms. And in some ways, you find accounts of actual torture machinery being first used to try to baptize Jews and get them to convert, or else they'd be killed because they were responsible for the Black Plague. You have that a lot in Spain, but you have the 14th century Black Plague era Rishon, none other than Rabbeinu Nisim, the Ran. This is the Ran, the very famous Ran. It's not clear which Spanish town he's born in, but he's pretty much he's fixed in Barcelona, in Spain. He didn't become a formal part of the rabbinate there, because the rabbinate was formalized. There was a chief rabbinate that was appointed, or at least acknowledged by the local authorities. He just wanted to be a Rosh Hashiva, so it's an interesting aspect. But what's interesting about the Ran, and this is something to think about and to conclude our share, is everything that happened in the 14th century inevitably caused a crisis of faith. People started to worry about and wonder about HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and how do we see HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and where's the world heading? And there were other factors, not just the Black Plague and the pogroms, but there was a financial meltdown and other factors. And out of this crisis, the Ran felt the need to publish a sefer to rebuild Jewish faith. And this sefer is none other than the Drashas Haran, which are basics of Emunah and Bitachon and theology. Again, in those days, it's theology, not necessarily Musar. I've wondered a lot whether the last 60 years we've underinvested in teaching Emunah and issues of theology, and we spent a lot of time Daf Yomi, reading Gemara, reading Tanakh, and for various reasons, which I've talked about and written about. And I wonder if after this event, I know a lot of people have reached out to me talking about Emunah Bitachon. Are we going to have to return to, in a Ran-type fashion, to start talking about Emunah Bitachon in ways that we just took for granted? We felt very comfortable in our Masara. So it's an open book. It's hard to know, but it's instructive and helpful to go back to. Yesterday we went back about 200 years to the 19th century. So here we're going back about 600 years, 650 years to the Black Plague. And it's also interesting to think about how the Jews reacted. In the 14th century, we were victimized. We really had no way to defend ourselves. By the 19th century, we're no longer being accused. It's a pandemic that affects the entire world, but it's no longer the Jews being scapegoated. And we have the freedom to create halachic solutions to some of the challenges I spoke about yesterday. And now we have our own state, and we'd like to think that, as I mentioned in my share yesterday, that we're setting a model for humanity. So I told the Israeli boys yesterday, whatever chumros, whatever severity we have to take, I hope that, and I think it's true, some of the nations will look to Israel to see the types of policies that hopefully, I believe that if we're able to control this virus, we're hopefully going to be able to set an example for an entire world. And that's part of our role as the Am HaNivchar. It's part of our role as Mamlechas Kohanim B'Gai Kadosh. So the Jews have to take more stringent, the Israeli state has to take more stringent measures. It's in line with our role as Mamlechas Kohanim B'Gai Kadosh. We have to take more mitzvahs so we can demonstrate to the world the type of lifestyle that will be helpful for them. So I'm hoping that's hard to know, but I'm hoping that when this is all over, Israel will be a role model, I hope, and we'll be able to broadcast the type of lifestyle that will help us get through this. So again, I want to try to be here every day. Some of the things I want to talk about, I made a quick list for myself today. We'll talk about Brachas Rasha Yatzar. We'll talk about people who got sick in Tanakh. We'll talk about a little Chassidus, right? How does Chassidus help us understand coronavirus? What are we meant to accomplish for Chassidus, and how can we accomplish this more during this process? And talk about Chazal's medicine. So I want to create a world in which we're able to use the crisis for personal growth, but also to think about areas that we don't often ponder. So Mitzvah Hashem, I'll try to keep to the schedule. I've got a lot happening, so I don't know what the schedule will be, but at least right now it seems like this is a good time for my schedule, probably a good time for Chatzarts as well. And again, everyone should think about how they can be an Oved Hashem. I know that this is primarily for younger adults, yeshiva bachrim, so certainly to be part of the solution in your homes. A lot of people are going to spend a lot of time at home, so don't be the person that increases the tension or the anxiety level. Be someone that smiles and helps and is optimistic and amidst Hashem. This is a nisayon from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and Hashem chose us is because we have the kochos, and He expects us to show the type of response that would make our ancestors who faced far, far greater challenges, both pandemics as well as far greater nightmares, make them proud. So Yeshikov to everyone, and I'll see you tomorrow. And there are plenty of shirim that I'm putting on YU Torah that I'm not recording, so please take a listen to those. Okay, Laila Tov, Boker Tov, Tzarayim Tovim, and most importantly, let's all daven for each other.